Frances sat on the slope, just below the top of the world, and could barely feel the wind piercing through her exhausted body. Today, she and her husband had achieved their greatest dream. Together, they had conquered Everest, but a few hours earlier, they were forced to part ways, and now she could only hope she would see him again. Suddenly, Frances heard unfamiliar voices nearby. Someone leaned over her, offered oxygen, rubbing her frostbitten hands, and said something meant to comfort her. But on Everest, in the death zone, meeting people doesn't always mean being saved, because helping someone here often means risking your own life. It's a brutal truth echoed by more than 200 bodies that still lie frozen beneath the summit. Today, I'll tell you about 5 of them, whose names have become part of this mountain forever. But as always, viewer discretion is advised. Case 1. Frances Arsentiev. Frances was never chasing fame. She worked as an accountant in Colorado, spending her days surrounded by numbers. But whenever she got the chance, she escaped to the mountains. That's where she met Sergei Arsentiev, a skilled Russian climber who had moved to the United States. Among mountaineers, Sergei was known as the Snow Leopard, a title given to those who conquer the 5 highest peaks of the former Soviet Union. Determined and charismatic, he captivated Frances instantly. They married soon after and began climbing together. Not long after that, she became the first American woman to ski down Mount Elbrus. Their success inspired a new dream: to climb Everest together without oxygen or Sherpa support. If they succeeded, Frances would become the first American woman to reach the summit without supplemental oxygen. Her son, 11-year-old Paul, didn't share her excitement. He once told her about a dream where 2 climbers were lost in a violent storm, wandering through broken ice and wind, unable to find their way back to camp. Frances only smiled and said that fear is another mountain you have to climb, step by step. By mid-May 1998, Frances and Sergei reached Everest Base Camp on May 20th, just after midnight. They left their final camp at 8,200 meters and began their summit push. But before dawn, both of their headlamps failed, forcing them to turn back. The next night, they tried again, but managed to climb only a few dozen meters higher before turning back. It was their 3rd day above 8,000 meters, deep in the death zone, where every breath is borrowed. They were breaking down physically and mentally, and they knew one more attempt would decide everything. On May 22nd, they climbed again, moving slowly through the thin air that burned their lungs. By around 7 p.m., they finally reached the summit. They were overjoyed, though they knew the most dangerous part still laid ahead: the descent into darkness. They decided to separate so at least one of them could reach camp. At dawn, Sergei stumbled into the tent, but Frances wasn't there. Without hesitation, he grabbed a tank of oxygen, a medical kit, and set off to find her. Around the same time, a team of Uzbek climbers ascending toward the top found Frances lying on the slope. She was barely conscious. They gave her oxygen, tried to warm her, and attempted to carry her down. Eventually, they were forced to stop. Their own oxygen was nearly gone. They left her and continued their climb. It was the only way to survive. Later that evening, as they descended, they saw a man climbing upward with an oxygen tank in his hand. It was Sergei. No one ever saw him alive again. At dawn on May 24th, climbers Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd noticed Frances on the open slope. Her jacket and gloves were scattered beside her, a sign of severe hypothermia, when the freezing body suddenly feels warm. Kathy leaned closer, held her, and heard a faint whisper: "Please, don't leave me. I'm American." They tried to lift her, but every move drained what little strength they had left. When they realized they couldn't save her, they turned back to call for help. Behind them, Frances remained in a quiet, almost peaceful pose. That's how she would be seen for years, known to every climber who passed by as the Sleeping Beauty of Everest. A year later, Sergei's body was found about 300 meters below her final resting place. In 2007, Ian Woodall returned to the mountain. He didn't go for the summit this time. Together with a small team, he reached Frances, wrapped her in an American flag, and placed a letter from her son Paul beside her. They then moved her into a deep ice gully, where snow and wind would finally hide her from the eyes of those who came after. Until her last breath, Frances may have believed Sergei would come back for her, but on Everest, most often than not, no one ever does. Case 2. David Sharp. David Sharp was 10 years old when he first climbed Roseberry Topping, a rocky hill in Yorkshire locals call Little Everest. That was where he first felt a strange peace, a kind he would spend the rest of his life chasing. Over the years, his climbs grew higher and harder. Kilimanjaro, Gashenbrunn, Cho-Oyu. But Everest became his obsession, the place where he believed peace turns absolute. In 2003, David made his first attempt to reach the top of the world. Bad weather and misjudged timing forced him to turn back just 300 meters below the summit. During the descent, his feet froze, and he lost several toes. 2 years later, he returned. This time, altitude sickness struck. He had ascended too quickly, without full acclimatization, and by 7,500 meters he felt dizzy, weak, and disoriented. Most would have taken those failures as a warning, but David only held tighter to his dream. Before his third attempt in 2006, his mother begged him to stay. "David, someone never comes back from Everest," she said. He smiled. "Don't worry, Mom. You're never alone up there." He was dead wrong. This time, David chose the cheapest and most dangerous option, a solo ascent. He paid only for a climbing permit and a spot in base camp. To most people, it seemed like suicide, but for him, it was a test of will. On May 14th, just after 1 in the morning, David left the last high camp. He planned to reach the summit by noon and return by sunset. But soon the wind grew violent and the temperature dropped below -40. Snow blew into his mask and the thin air made his head spin. By sunset, exhausted and nearly out of strength, he reached a small rocky alcove at about 8,500 meters. Climbers call it Green Boots Cave. His legs gave out and he sank onto the stone, resting his back against the wall and closing his eyes, convincing himself it was just a short break before the final push. The first to spot him were Sherpas descending from the summit. He sat motionless, and most assumed he was the long-dead climber known as Green Boots. But one Sherpa, Dawa, came closer and heard a faint voice. "My name is David Sharp. I just want to sleep." He tried to give him oxygen and pull him up, but the frozen body didn't respond. At that altitude, every minute without movement brings you closer to death. That day, more than 40 climbers passed by David. They didn't do it out of cruelty. They followed an unwritten, cruel rule of the death zone. To save another often means to die yourself. By evening, his breathing had stopped. He remained there, sitting quietly, facing the summit he would never reach. In the end, he found absolute peace, just not in the way that he had hoped for. Later, his mother said, "I don't blame anyone. At that height, you can only save yourself." David had the determination to chase his goal, but the human body has its limits. Perhaps if he had grown up among the clouds, his strength might have lasted just long enough for that final climb. Case 3. Swang Paljor. Swang Paljor was one of such natural climbers. He was born among the mountain valleys of Ladakh, over 3,000 meters above sea level in northern India. As a young man, he often joined high-altitude training expeditions with the Indian-Tibetan border police, climbing the icy peaks of Kashmir, Sikkim, and Ladakh. He learned to work places where most people would collapse after only a few dozen steps. By the age of 20, he was already considered one of the strongest and most resilient climbers in his unit. That reputation earned him a place in India's 1996 National Everest expedition. The team's mission was to raise the Indian flag on the summit from the mountain's northern Tibetan side for the very first time. In early March, they established their base camp at about 5,200 meters. While others struggled to adapt to the thin air, Swang moved confidently through camp, hauling gear in his bright green boots. On the night of May 10, 1996, Swang Paljor, Swang Samanla, and Dorje Morup began their ascent toward the summit. The weather was unusually calm for Everest. The wind had stopped, the sky was clear, and the temperature around -20 degrees felt almost pleasant for that height. They climbed slowly, but steadily, breathing in rhythm, like soldiers marching in formation. At 3:45 p.m., they radioed a short message from the top. "We are on the summit, all is well." They had arrived later than planned, but in base camp, there was celebration. The Indian flag was flying on the roof of the world. By 5 p.m., as the sun dipped behind the ridge, everything changed. Winds rose suddenly, tearing snow from the slopes and throwing it across their faces at nearly 90 kilometers per hour. The temperature plummeted to -35. After more than 10 hours of climbing, the three soldiers were no longer fighting for the summit, but for every step towards safety. That night, the lights were seen high on the slope. Those in camp hoped it was the Indian team making their way down. At dawn on May 11th, a Japanese group climbing toward the summit reached about 8,500 meters and came upon a man in bright green boots sitting in a small limestone alcove. He was barely breathing, his arms wrapped around his knees, his head resting forward. One of the Japanese climbers bent down and heard a faint request for help, but their oxygen was nearly gone. The tanks had been emptied during their own climb, and they had no strength to share air or carry him down. After a short discussion, they made the painful decision to continue upward. When they passed the spot again on their descent, Swang Paljor was no longer moving. The place of his death is now known as Green Boots Cave. Yes, the same alcove that would later harbor dying David Sharp, and where he would be almost mistaken for an original Green Boots guy. It was the Indian miracle climber all along. At least, it is believed to be his body. Perhaps the others, Swang Samanla and Dorje Morup, could have survived the storm and returned to camp if they had been guided by someone with years of experience in such conditions. Case 4. Scott Fisher. Still, the storm that struck Everest on May 10th and 11th, 1996, became the deadliest in more than a decade, while it had already claimed the lives of 3 Indian climbers. 2 of the world's most respected guides were still alive on the mountain, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. Both led commercial expeditions and believed that experience and discipline could help overcome even the most dangerous peak on Earth. In 1984, Fisher founded Mountain Madness, a company that didn't just sell climbs, but inspired courage. People trusted him because he conquered Denali, Makalu, Cho-Oyu, K2, and Lhotse. Moreover, he had already summited Everest without oxygen in 1994 and returned 2 years later to lead his own team. This time, his group included 8 clients, 3 guides, Anatoly Bokriv, Lobsang Zhangbu, and Neil Beidelman, and 8 Sherpas. On May 6, 1996, the team left base camp. Everything went according to plan until one of the climbers, Scott's close friend Dale Cruz, fell ill and was stranded between camps. Without hesitation, Fisher descended from over 6,000 meters to help him back to base. When he rejoined his team, they noticed he looked pale and exhausted. His eyes were dim. He moved slowly. These were the first signs of altitude sickness, when the body can no longer recover because it is starved of oxygen. Before dawn on May 10th, the team began their final ascent. Progress was painful. The clients struggled, often losing their direction, and every time Fisher helped them back on track, he walked last, watching everyone, making sure no one was left behind. Like the Indian climbers, they reached the summit around 3:45 p.m., nearly 2 hours past the safe turnaround time. Fisher smiled for a photo, but the brightness in his eyes was gone, as if he could already feel the storm drawing near. An hour and a half later, the mountain disappeared under a whiteout. Ropes that marked the route were buried beneath the snow, and dozens of climbers from different teams lost their way. Fisher stumbled as he descended, weaker with every step. Lobsang supported him, but he could see his guide fading. At around 8,400 meters, Fisher stopped and said quietly, "Go down. Find Bokriv. Tell him I'm okay." Lobsang didn't want to leave, but he knew if he stayed, they would both die. He went down in search of Bokriv, who was already rescuing clients, navigating through the storm by the flicker of headlamps. It wasn't until the morning of May 11th that Bokriv finally reached Fisher. In his journal, he wrote, "His down suit was open, his hands were bare. It was over, but he looked peaceful, as if the mountain had taken back her son." Not far from where Fisher lay, another legend of mountaineering, Rob Hall, faced his own final test, not of strength, but of loyalty. Case 5. Rob Hall. Throughout his remarkable career, Hall had summited the mountain 5 times and completed the 7 Summits Challenge, climbing the highest peak on every continent. Through his adventure consultants team, he had guided 39 clients to the top of the world, more than anyone else before him. His expeditions were the most expensive, costing around $65,000. But people didn't pay for comfort. They paid for the confidence that with Rob Hall, they would surely come back alive. By late April 1996, Rob arrived at base camp with 8 clients and 2 guides, Mike Groom and Andy Harris. Among them was Doug Hansen, a mailman from the United States who had turned back just a few hundred meters from the summit the previous year. That time, Rob had promised him, "Next time, we'll go all the way." Just before midnight on May 10th, the adventure consultants team began their final ascent, almost side by side with Scott Fisher's group. But not long after, they stopped. At one of the most technical sections, they discovered that the ropes had not yet been fixed, and climbers from multiple expeditions were now bottlenecked on the route. The guides lost over an hour waiting for the lines to be set, and oxygen supplies were steadily running low. Rob Hall moved last, watching over the group. He was especially worried about Doug, who was struggling with exhaustion. Doug fell to his knees more than once, but Rob kept lifting him, saying quietly, "Just a little more, Doug. We can do this." By noon, most guides had already begun turning their clients around to reach camp before dark. But Rob and Doug kept going. And at around 2:45 p.m., they finally stood on the summit. They had reached the summit about an hour before Scott Fisher's team, but that small victory would soon mean nothing. On the way down, just 90 meters below the summit, Doug's oxygen ran out. His face turned blue as he sank into the snow. Realizing a storm was closing in, Rob tried to revive him, sharing his own oxygen and calling his name, but Doug was barely breathing. At 4:30 p.m., Hall radioed base camp. "Doug is out of oxygen," he said. "He can't move." He asked for more supplies to be sent up, but the Sherpas were scattered across the slope. The reply came through static. "Do what you can, Rob, but you need to get down." He knew what that meant. If he left, Doug would die. If he stayed, they both would. But leaving him behind was never an option. At 4:45 a.m., when the camp had already assumed the worst, his voice suddenly broke through the radio again. "This is Rob. Doug's gone. My regulator's frozen. I have no oxygen." Later, climbers learned that during the night, guide Andy Harris had reached Rob with oxygen and water. They tried to restart the flow, but the valve had frozen solid. Andy went back down for help and was never seen again. Rob went silent for nearly 5 hours before asking to be connected to New Zealand. On the line was Jan Arnold, his wife, a doctor and fellow mountaineer. They had once stood together on the summit in 1993, but this time she was home, 7 months pregnant. "Rob, can you hear me?" "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here. We're going to get you out. Hold on. It's okay. I'm at peace. Sleep well, my darling. Please don't worry too much." When the storm cleared, on May 23rd, climbers found his body sitting upright, facing the summit, radio still in his frozen hand. Beside him lay Doug Hansen. Rob kept his word until the very end. "We climb together, and we come down together." Everyone who rests on Everest has their own story, but they were all searching for the same thing, that fleeting moment when you stand above the world and it feels like you've touched eternity. They gave all their strength and their lives, and in the end, they became part of the mountain they loved. Which story moved you the most? And do you think any of them could have ended differently? Let me know in the comments.